right? Well, apparently my introduction was muted, but anyhow, we're here today in the Tier 10 Japanese aircraft carrier Hakuryu in the final installment of our Clan Battles review of the Tier 10 carriers. We're on the map Shatter, and the mode is Domination in pure Tier 10 matchmaking against an enemy Midway. The enemy team has 4 destroyers, a Gearing, Shimakaze, Holland, starting off by launching our rocket planes in order to scout. Because they are the fastest planes, you'll note first of all it's a 3x3 setup, similar to that of the Midway and the Audacious. However, planes are much squishier. You can see the full 9-plane squadron has just about only 1,500 or 15,000, sorry, hit points, rather than the 23,000 of the Audacious squadrons, or the just about 21,000 of the Midway's F8 F Bearcats. So much squishier. Now in exchange, they are relatively fast as I find the Holland, not exactly an ideal target. He has no smoke, but his AA is actually fairly potent for a destroyer. You can see him easily trimming down 2 of my rockets, or 3 of my rockets now, with just his priority sector. Did not see a defensive fire boost. Nevertheless, he has a heal, but no smoke, and his AA is on, so I'm going to try and go for one blind hit. Arming early, of course, to avoid the long arming time, but fail to secure a sufficient lead. I do know where he is. He's headed straight for my Clever, so I should give my Clever some information. Now the rockets themselves have 30mm of penetration, 15% fire chance, and 3100 alpha, so substantially less damaging than those of the Midway, and missing that penetration. A little more penetration than those of the Audacious, so 30mm cruiser midsection, for example, will be penetratable. So generally a pretty good anti-cruiser and anti-destroyer rocket, more or less. However, it has much lower density than those of the Audacious for anti-destroyer duties. Only 6 rockets per plane with a 3x3 setup means 18 rockets per pass. The rockets do hit about a third more, but you have about 66% less rockets, so overall less anti-destroyer potential. Holland ducking into cover, kind of blinding me to the majority of my rockets, but it does in fact beach him and expose him to my Clebers. Torpedoes, so the harassment of myself and the Clever mostly really, doing in one destroyer in quick succession. Now you don't really want to lean for the rockets too much, just finishing them off here since I already flew out with them, and scouting the other side. There's that enemy Shimakaze, and you can see me hitting the midsection of the enemy Hindenburg for full penetrations thanks to my 30mm pen. If I had been a Audacious with only 28, I would have gotten some amount of shatters there. 2 fires as well from the 15% fire chance. Kind of showing off how you can make up for relatively low fire chance with just the raw number of projectiles. I'm gonna go after that Hindenburg with torpedo bombers because I scored a fire. And so because I saw myself scoring that fire, I am going to try and score a flood with my powerful torpedoes. These are of course the Hakuryu torpedoes, a 2x6 setup, so they're launched in pairs, unlike the triples of the Audacious and the sextuple sets of the Midway. However, the spread is much more narrow in comparison, obviously, because you're only launching 2 compared to the 6 or 3 or 6 of the Midway and Audacious. And each torpedo hits for a whopping 9,300 torpedo alpha, and they do 55 knots unlike the 40 knots of the other 2 nations' torpedoes. You can see that Hindenburg taking a 7,000 damage torpedo and then an 8,000 damage torpedo, the first striking him on his torpedo bulge, of course. No flood, however. The 55 knot speed means that these are extremely potent torpedoes, which gives them a little bit more flexibility when compared to those of the Midway or Audacious. Much easier to land against maneuvering targets. However, the lead time is very long. You can see it takes a significant time to arm, however. Torpedoes are a very lethal source of damage. Arming to dodge the flak there, by the way. Score that permanent flooding. His engine's out. They're just going to hit him with a torpedo here because he's going to slide right in. That arming distance, though, quite notable. Hopefully he gets hit. If not, well, I'm going to have to go back for him because I want to make sure he doesn't heal. He's still flooding. Oh, no, he has damage control. So I think what I'm going to do is swoop over onto the enemy Shimakaze, who apparently does not have a smokescreen, and then swoop out to that Hindenburg, who did pop a heal, but he has damage control to flood, Alright, I missed my first pass. I'm gonna stay with the original plan though. Best to try and finish off my targets. This is worth an engine cooling, so bringing my high-speed rocket planes over. Let's get a fighter, but I'm just looking for a fire, but I might be able to get the raw alpha. To be honest, slowing down a little at the end to get the reticle to tighten and making sure I don't overshoot. Fighter does tag, I'd fail to secure enough alpha damage to finish him off, which means I'm gonna have to go back for him, unfortunately. Now since I know I'm gonna have to go back, I am gonna go after the Shimakaze. Looks like the bulk of my forces on that side have collapsed, so it's time to turn my carrier hull around. We're trading kind of evenly, but we are up a destroyer in exchange for being down a cruiser using my low detectability range to kind of sneak up on the Shimakaze. Another advantage of the Japanese torpedo bombers is that with just concealment module I can drop, or with just concealment expert on my captain, I can drop my concealment down to 6.75. You can drop them down to a further 6.01 if that's your preference, but that does of course come at the cost of the deck space module. You can see the high speed of the Japanese torpedo making it extremely difficult to dodge, and he takes 5,000 torpedo alpha from the airdrop torpedo. Those raking or straddling torpedoes kind of making things inconvenient for him. Now my planes are squishy, but they are fast and they handle relatively well. Turning circle of Japanese aircraft is not the best, but is not insubstantial. Looks like he doesn't have a smokescreen, and my Clever has arrived, so now I have some firepower. So I'm simply spotting for my allied Clever and inconveniencing things for him, making it a bit harder for him to dodge, gliding towards from behind, so now he can't turn in a certain axis. He does manage to dodge. He's trying to make a run for his fading smoke, but as it is fading, he's not going to have too much reprieve here. He's trying to pop his own smoke now. Just going to stay over him for as long as possible. My torpedo is speeding toward him at 55 knots, you can see, and quite clearly I'm able to dispatch him with the full weight of my Hakuryu squadron. Enemy Repub, surprisingly one of the few battleships that is resistant to the APDVs of the Hakuryu. I just demonstrated the flexibility of the Hakuryu torpedo bomber thanks to its high speed and huge alpha against both light targets like destroyers and medium targets like enemy cruisers like the Hindenburg. But the Hakuryu also packs an anti-heavy ship weapon, not that the torpedoes of 9,000 damage are an anti-heavy weapon. The armor-piercing dive bomber, these are carried on a substantially tanky J5N, so just as fast as the torpedo bomber, reaching just about 200 knots fully boosted with this build. Each plane carries a 8,500 alpha bomb in a 3x4 setup, so you drop 3 bombs per pass for a whopping 25,000 alpha. And what this means is that any target that can get Citadel, such as this Hindenburg, for example, is potentially at a risk of dying if they're even below 25,000 health. Single Citadel there for 8,500. You can see the accuracy does suffer. They stacked AA of 2 targets, chewing through the relatively fragile APDB, but now I just have to land 1 bomb, which is why it's worth trying to go for a second pass here. Doesn't look like I'm going to have quite at the HP. I'm going to try and nail him on the center, and I do manage to land that 1 bomb with a suspect-looking reticle. And that easily punches through the Hindenburg's hull. The vertical deck armor of most ships is quite a bit thinner than the horizontal belt armor, which is why APDBs are extremely effective against most cruisers and the vast majority of battleships, Conqueror included, thanks to the fact that her Citadel has been raised from below the waterline to just about the waterline. There was a fighter drop there, so I do have to be a bit careful, but this Cyclone will actually buy me more time to actually demonstrate the impact of the Hakuryu. In addition to the raw damage distributed or inflicted by the armor-piercing dive bomber, I'm going to sneak up on this Conqueror basically undetected, by the way, thanks to that 6.75 detection again, and use the torpedoes against a heavier target. But as I was saying, the APDB, in addition to inflicting massive amounts of alpha damage, is also basically unhealable. citadels are healable to 33%. You can score a flood on the Conqueror by cruisers, and 10% by battleships, which makes them an extremely potent weapon against ship classes that can heal. Torpedoes, similarly, when hitting against a torpedo bulge in the center of a ship, will inflict relatively unhealable damage that's considered citadel damage, and again, will only allow 10% of the damage to be healed. You can see that fast-moving and relatively small target of the Smolensk is quite challenging to hit, but if I do manage to get these last two torpedoes off, his AA is pretty potent, and score some hits because of the 9000 alpha, I will have no trouble dealing large amounts of damage to him. However, since I am a bit lazy, or because I can, and I should cycle through my squadrons, still have plenty of reserves nevertheless, because I scored a flood on that Conqueror, I'm just going to go back for a fire, make sure this game is quite secure. The Conqueror does have a super heal, so again, when you're against a super healing ship, reducing the damage you deal to only 10% healable will drastically reduce the capability of the Conqueror to heal. So any torpedo damage he takes on the midsection, as well as APDB damage, is likely to inflict massive amounts of damage. Now I don't actually need to bring all 9 planes, ducking out through the side of the fighter squadron here with the relatively maneuverable and fast A8M Rikufuku rocket planes. Now they only have 30 mils of pen, which means you get a ton of shatters, but double fire is what I'm after. Gliding through toward the Smolensk, which is covered in very thin armor, where this 30 mil pen is more than sufficient. You can see that combined AA and fragility of the Hakuryu's squadrons overall, however, causing some difficulties in getting to the target. Conqueror is burning from that double fire. Looks like he is not able to damage control since he used it for that earlier flood. I'm going to move toward the cap, and I do flood out the Hakuryu. Midway torpedo bomber squadron headed forward, likely for one of my heavies. Probably this GK. Trying to screen me off, I guess, by dropping a fighter. My hull personally is too close, so the anti-heavy target torpedoes of the Midway will have no problem killing off my GK there, but there's nothing I can do about that. Just going to take my 200 knot APGBs and try and find the Smolensk for the Montana. Finally, the Smolensk opens up, and notice he's at 14,000 health, which means as long as I don't clip too much flak, I will be able to dispatch him. However, the game does in fact end before I can continue exerting influence because the team does run out of points. 116,000 damage, a very short game. 7 torpedo hits, 2 bomb hits, 1 plane kill by hull, 5 incaps, 3 kills, 4 fires, 4 floodings, 2 citadels, 8 spotting ribbons, 41 rocket hits, and 2 planes shot down by fighter. Very short and fast game, but kind of showing off the brutal firepower of the Hakuryu in a quick 1700 base experience game. And you saw there at the beginning, just taking a look, didn't get the greatest hits with rockets on the Howland. They are, of course, not as ideally suited as the rockets of either of the other 2 carriers. The Midway, of course, with her 68 mil pen, Tiny Tims can hit whatever she wants, and her Tiny Tims do massive amounts of damage with that 5400 alpha and 30% fire chance. And then the Audacious, on the other hand, launches 42 28mm penetration rockets, which have no problem saturating an area and absolutely pummeling light targets, able to chunk for upwards of 15,000 damage against larger area targets such as battleships, superstructure, for example. However, against that Des Moines, or against the Hindenburg rather, where we hit in the midsection with rockets for just about 10,000 and set 2 fires. That's something the Audacious rockets cannot do, on the other hand, unlike those of the Hakuryu, because even though there's more of them, and they do more damage kind of overall to light targets, they lack armor penetration, so they're not as versatile against medium armor targets such as cruisers, unlike those of the Hakuryu. Torpedoes, of course, are the bread and butter of the Hakuryu, with that massive 2x6 squadron. It's just 7 torpedo hits inflicted 44,000 damage, which is a large amount, obviously, thanks to that 9,000 torpedo alpha per torpedo. And then even though you don't have HEDBs, you still can inflict dots because the rockets are reasonable fire starters and you have a good flood chance on the torpedoes, which leads to a good ability to inflict dots as well, especially with those 55 knot torpedoes. And the bombs we demonstrated only very briefly, but the bombs that we did land on the Hindenburg in particular did inflict some crippling damage, which is of course relatively unhealable as we went over. So that in a smaller setting, so that was a full random battle, but you can imagine in a smaller setting, being able to inflict that much damage to cruiser-sized targets, especially those like the Hindenburg, or say the Moskva and Stalingrad, which are relatively static and thus easy to hit with APTVs. A Moskva, for example, has just about 62,000 hit points, so getting a full strike, or even a 2/3 potency strike of 17,000 takes a chunk of about 20% out of the total health of the Moskva almost immediately. And this is of course relatively unhealable, again Citadel damage is only 33% healable, so... Again, you have that huge potency. The Hakuryu, in addition, compared to the Audacious, does have slightly larger reserves, so you got 16 rocket planes, 17 torpedo bombers, if I'm not mistaken. Or 26 rather, I'm kind of trolling. 26 torpedo bombers, which is an enormous amount. And then 20 dive bombers, so more planes actually than the other two carriers as well. The regen times are kind of mediocre, 74 seconds, 70 seconds, and 69 seconds respectively, but are substantially better than the Audacious's regeneration times, if I'm not mistaken. If we glance over here, the tough and tanky planes here have 74, 89, so about 20-second advantage on the torpedo bombers, and another 15 or so seconds advantage on the level bombers compared to the Audacious. And of course, these Hakuryu planes carry much more potent munitions, even if they are individually more fragile. The planes themselves, of course, are quite fast, as I mentioned, 250 knots on the rockets boosted, 194 on the torpedo bombers, and 202. You can boost this further with speed module if you choose to take it, although, which I believe I am taking, although I'm missing the speed skill in the captain. But that's an aside. Now, unlike the other two carriers, the secondary armament is actually worth talking about on the Hak. So you will see here she is equipped with the Japanese 100mm. This has a default range of 5.3 kilometers. You won't be boosting it, but it is of note compared to the other secondary weapons, because it's a powerful dual-purpose mount with 30mm of base penetration. You can see here HE shell armor penetration 30, which means you pen all cruiser bow and sterns, and also most cruiser midsections outside of the heavily armored Russian cruiser midsections. So in close quarters, the Hakuryu is actually quite capable of defending herself. Of course, you won't last very long because most carriers in close quarters against most high-tier cruisers are quite fragile by comparison. But it does mean you have some form of self-defense as a last-ditch weapon. As for the carrier hull itself, you will note that with just one concealment skill on the captain, you go down to 13.7, so fairly respectable amongst tier 10 carriers. And just like the midway that comes before her, the Hakuryu has a uniform armored deck, in this case 95mm, which is basically immune to all armor-piercing and high explosive. Unlike the Audacious, just like the midway, the Hakuryu has a uniform armored deck which resists high explosive bombs and rockets alike. Instead, the only vulnerable locations are this extensive, admittedly raised superstructure and this side plate of 19. Belt-wise, the belt is not quite as high as the midways, so not as protected, but a uniform 130mm on both sides. If you strip away the armor, you will note that the citadel, however, is quite raised, so slightly above the waterline, and centered around the central smokestack and island. So if you show broadside, you can get punished in the Hakuryu. However, the presence of this uniform armored deck protects you from an enemy Hakuryu's APTVs. She won't get any citadels, just penetration hits. Because of the thickness of the plate, just the bombs will just arm and fuse before they can reach the citadel at that height. And of course, HETVs and rockets from all carriers, from the Midway, Audacious, and Hakuryu herself, will all shatter on this 95mm deck. And at range, cruiser AP, battleship AP, basically anything that's not a Conqueror or Thunderer will shatter or bounce against this armored deck, which makes the Hakuryu extremely tanky. So in carrier-on-carrier combat, the Hakuryu is almost assuredly a king, especially because torpedo bombers are the best munition against enemy carriers, thanks to that armored deck. And the Hakuryu just so happens to have the most potent carrier-launched torpedo at 9,300 per torpedo, which allows him to deliver a substantial punch with just a single pair of hits, thus mitigating her losses better than the other two carriers when attacking carriers, as well as inflicting more damage with an easier to lead torpedo. So overall, the Hack just gets the best torpedoes, a very, very potent anti-cruiser slash anti-battleship weapon in the APDVs, and a fairly decent rocket, which is not as good as those of the Midway against all targets, and not as specialized against light targets as those of the Audacious, but is overall a relatively flexible and usable rocket. So all these three things together combined allow the Hakuryu to assert her dominance and quickly crush the opposition, as you saw there on that fast match we had just now. Module-wise, I'm currently running this spec. So the first two slots are no-brainers. There's only 2 aircraft modules, so take aircraft engines in slot 2 and aircraft modification 1 in slot 1. Slot 3, there's some arguments for several things. You can take attack aircraft mod if you prefer, but I find the extra attack time on the relatively finicky rockets of the Hakuryu, which require you to kind of move fairly straight and are kind of stiff once you lock into the attack, to be kind of useless. So I prefer TBM1, which adds 5 seconds to aim time, which allows you to get nice, perfect strikes. Now remember from the commentary that the arming distance of the Hakuryu torpedo bomber is actually quite extensive. If you go here, you can see the torpedo arming distance here is 738 meters with my current spec, which ends up being, well, 3/4 of a kilometer, which is quite a bit of space. So what TBM1 allows you to do is to arm your torpedoes out from a very far distance and get a nice straight reticle before finally pushing the torpedoes in at the last few seconds. So that way you get nice, perfect drops if you want them. The other option is, of course, aerial torpedoes modification 1, which adds 5% torpedo speed, so in exchange for losing out on the extra 5 seconds of aim time that you could potentially have, you add 3 knots of speed to the 55 knot torpedoes, pushing them from 55 to 58 knots. Now this is not bad. I personally prefer the extra aim time if necessary, but if you want slightly faster torpedoes, the 3 knots of speed is not bad. Percentage-wise though, if you compare taking torpedo speed on the Midway or Audacious compared to that of the Hakuryu, Midway and Audacious get 2 knots of speed for taking the module, Hakuryu gets 3. 2 knots when you have 40 knot base speed is actually a decent amount, 5%. Well, it's a decent increase in comparison, whereas adding 3 knots of speed to 55, which is already very, very fast, by comparison is a smaller benefit overall, even if the percentage is technically the same. Slot 4, pretty obvious. You want bombers modification 2, add HP to those dive bombers. Now, all your squadrons are fragile, so all of them could use extra HP where possible. However, the rocket planes are relatively expendable, less important. The torpedo bombers are very important, and probably your best squadron overall. However, they have access to that carrier torpedo bomber heal, and so they can mitigate a lack of HP by just using the heal consumable properly when necessary to dive through heavy AA. And thus it comes to the APDVs, which don't have a heal but have to dive through even more AA because they have to get right on top of the target in order to inflict damage. So that is where I choose to put my extra HP. I think it's viable to put it on either torpedo bombers or the APDVs. I just prefer to put it onto the APDVs for the aforementioned reasons. Slot 5, now you have 2 options, concealment module and flight control mod. I choose to go with flight control mod for the extra raw planes and regen time. The extra concealment is nice. It drops your concealment down to, I believe, about 12.4 kilometers and brings your torpedo bombers down to 6.01 kilometers. Surface detection, which allows them to do many like stealthy attacks to give the opponents minimum time to respond and thus minimum time to dodge. However, 6.75 is already much stealthier than other torpedo bombers anyway, and still relatively gives you fairly minimal response time in comparison to, say, the 9 kilometer spot range of the Midway and Audacious torpedoes. So I prefer to go with Flight Control Mod 1 for the extra 2 planes on deck and the extra 5% regen time. And then last but not least, because the Hakuryu's planes are the squishiest, normally I go for Air Cruise Modification 2 for plane HP, but because my planes are already fairly squishy, I actually opt for plane speed. My attack planes, outside of the rockets, are the fastest overall attack planes, reaching just about 200 knots. So since my speed is already pretty good, and because the clan battle setting is a bit smaller than that of a random battle, with less ships you have less overlapping AA, so you have less overall need for HP, you can get away with using speed. And what speed does is, A, it decreases your time inside of enemy AA because you pass through AA levels faster, thus theoretically increasing your tankiness that way. And B, it also increases your damage output because your sortie time, or your time between hitting targets, is briefer because your carrier planes take off from the carrier and reach the target faster by that much, in this case 5%. Moving on to my captain. This is my hack captain, my hack competitive captain, I guess you could say. It's been the same for a while, but just in case you haven't been around, this is my preferred spec. So you take air supremacy, torpedo acceleration to get the torpedoes to 55 knots instead of 50, aircraft armor, and then survivability expert. This is the Core 9 build. And then usually here you take plane speed plus last gasp for your next few skills, but last gasp, as I mentioned on the Hakuryu briefly, is less useful because your squadrons are so large. So in the 3x3 setups of the Midway and Audacious, for example, like the Audacious torpedo bombers, it's very easy to get the last gas to proc on that last squadron. Often you'll make one attack, start making your turn, and throughout the course of the turn, AA will trim down your planes to that last 3 planes of your squadron, thus proccing last gasp and refilling your boost bar. However, with a 2x6 setup like the torpedo bombers of the Hakuryu, you attack once and then you lose maybe 4 planes, and you still have to get through another 4 planes before last gasp triggers, so it's less important and thus less of a priority. Which is why I would recommend actually taking Core 9 skills here and then actually going immediately for aiming systems, or sight stabilization rather. So sight stabilization is not actually necessary on the Hakuryu, but in a competitive setting is very important because every second matters. So I believe it should save you about 0.3 seconds on the APDVs especially, which are your most potent and most affected squadron by sight stabilization. So that 0.3 seconds might be the difference between launching 3 bombs or launching 2 bombs on a last attack, for example. And this can be very critical in a competitive setting, so I do recommend taking sight stabilization in that regard. So I'd probably take these 13 points first, and then after that go for Concealment Expert next, actually, putting you to 17. Just to bring down your hull concealment and get your planes to be fairly stealthy while taking the extra deck space as well. And thereafter, my preferred spec from that point is just to take Improved Engine Boost plus Last Gasp. Now, because of the deficiencies of Last Gasp on the Hakuryu, as I mentioned, there is actually quite some merit to not taking either of these 2 1-pointers and putting it into Improved Engines, or alternatively Adrenaline Rush, although Adrenaline Rush on a low HP aircraft squadron like those of the Hakuryu is relatively less effective. But that's kind of up to you. This is, however, my preferred spec. Take these 13 points on the Hakuryu first, especially for a clan battle setting, and then afterwards with the remaining 6 points, do as you please. If you don't think concealment's not necessary, you can of course take speed plus Adrenaline Rush, or you can even take some AA skills, potentially, or a mix of 1-pointers. There are plenty of ways to spec the Hakuryu, but just make sure you take these 13 skills. Anyhow, lots of time in port, not so much time in game, because the Hakuryu just ravaged that game as my team kind of pushed through. But this is, of course, the alpha predator of World of Warships, quite possibly the single most powerful ship at tier 10 at the moment, so if you have access to her, I would highly recommend bringing the Hakuryu to your upcoming clan battles, because this is far and away the strongest carrier. In summary, she has some of the best armor, she has pretty usable rockets, not the best, but pretty usable, against all targets as well, even against battleships, which have too much armor for her to actually penetrate. They still have plenty of superstructure, and the fire chance is not bad, and superstructure alpha is still workable. And then after the fairly middling rockets, you have the best torpedoes launched by an aircraft carrier in the game because of the massive alpha, high speed, and the huge reserves of 26 aircraft on deck. The high speed of the torpedoes and the planes makes them fairly difficult to dodge, and they are very stealthy, which means you can use them quite flexibly to even spot out and destroy destroyers as necessary. This is quite a bit easier with the 55-knot torpedoes, which are faster than most destroyers than, say, the 40-knot torpedoes of the Midway and Audacious, which are more or less the same speed as some speed-boosted destroyers. And of course, as I mentioned, that 9300 torpedo alpha of unhealable damage is a big boon. And then, of course, last but not least, you have the armor-piercing dive bombers, the infamous Hakuryu 255, the 25,500 alpha potential of unhealable citadel damage, which plunges from the sky and absolutely shreds cruisers and battleships alike. So, the sum total of this package of heavy munitions, heavy armor, good stealth, and good plane handling makes the Hakuryu the best carrier for clan battles in a relatively undisputed fashion. that said, I hope you enjoyed this brief commentary and not so brief overview of the Hakuryu. I wish you the best of luck in the upcoming clan battle season, and I will catch you all later. Cheers!